Good morning. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum at the Wilson Center, and I'd like to welcome you to our, well, in DC, a rainy Monday morning meeting called Do All Carbon Roads Lead to Paris? It's a climate action in the US and China discussion today. And I pretty much brought together my go-to people when I have questions about energy, climate, coal, energy efficiency, and electric vehicles. I call these five people. So I want to give us a really a short intro today because we're at exciting times right now. I mean, well, there's the downside that the climate crisis is getting worse. I mean, countries have not been completely meeting their Paris climate agreements, but there's now more movement in the US and China with declarations by Xi Jinping in September that China will hit a carbon neutral level by 2060. The incoming Biden and Harris administration has promised to integrate climate policy across all different sectors. And they also, I believe, are going to be declaring a 2050 carbon neutrality pledge. And to dig into this today, we're going to start off with Jake Schmidt and Alvin Lin from Natural Resources Defense Council. Jake is the Managing Director of International Programs, and Alvin is the China Climate and Energy Policy Director. I'm glad that they're going to start us off today discussing kind of the trends and opportunities for US, China, for low carbon investments and policies, and what maybe, what can be done to stimulate the economies in the process. And then we're going to shift on over to Carolyn Szum. She's a program manager at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And I couldn't believe when I read your bio, Carolyn, there's like 17 years have been working on US, China, clean energy work, also stuff in Europe. But today we want you to focus on China and the US. So she's done lots on energy efficient buildings. So she's going to talk about some of the trends that are going on in China with energy efficiency buildings, a big energy user in China, as well as some new tools that Lawrence Berkeley National Lab has developed to help kind of make it easier to retrofit buildings in China, US, and elsewhere. And then we're going to pivot on over to Li Shuo, who is a senior climate and energy policy officer at Greenpeace China. And he's going to take us on I think, a little deeper dive into coal, talk a little bit about the challenges to carbon neutrality in China. And then last but never least is Ilaria Mazzocco, who she is at the Paulson Institute today, but I have to brag that she used to work for me a few years back as a research assistant, but ended up getting a PhD at SAIS focused on electric vehicles in China dissertation. So we're going to drive on out the end of the meeting here, bad pun intended there. I'm talking about electric vehicles, which is also a sector that the Biden-Harris administration wants to emphasize as part of our climate path. So with that quick intro, I'm going to mute, and Alvin and Jake, the virtual floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, the China Environment Forum, for inviting me to this critical conversation at such an important moment. Obviously, it's been a very tough 4 years, but there's new light. We have a new American administration, and we are witnessing more aggressive climate action from China. So I'll focus, as Jennifer mentioned, briefly on the American dynamic, as my colleague Alvin will discuss a bit more the China situation in detail. So I think the Biden and Harris administration will need to do two things simultaneous, and it will need to be bolder than previous administration and by leaps and bounds in each of these areas. So first, obviously the US needs to get its own house in order. President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris ran on the most progressive climate agenda of any presidential campaign. They made it clear that addressing climate change is a top priority, as one of the 4 crises that confronts America at this moment. And you can see this prioritization beginning to emerge in their early nominations of Secretary Kerry and Brian Deese in the National Economic Council. Unfortunately, the Biden-Harris administration comes into office with, a bit more of a hole than we had been anticipating when we left the Paris Agreement. And so, let me share my screens now. We're seeing, a huge, sorry about that. So we've seen in the last 4 years a number of states, cities, and companies building a very solid foundation for more climate action in the intervening years. Biden can build upon and utilize this local action and helping to drive greater climate action in the coming years. That means using the power of the US government procurement. US is one of the largest, single buyers in the world, if not the largest, while also setting climate pollution standards for power plants, cars, and other major sources of pollution. And it also means continuing to unleash this mobilization that's happening at the state, city, company level in the US. So the federal government now can become a helper of those efforts, not a barrier as it was under the last 4 years. These actions will obviously help to address local air pollution, create jobs, address the inequities in America's society, and also cut greenhouse gas emissions. So according to analysis from America's Pledge, the set of measures that the states, cities can drive, coupled with more supportive federal action, can put the US in the range of a 50% cut below 2005 levels by 2030. So next piece that the US, obviously this domestic action is central to how the US can help mobilize greater international climate action. As Biden likes to say, we will lead not only by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. So it's not just the words that we're saying, but also how the US is acting at home. To deliver on this, the US will need to have a second piece of its climate agenda working in quite a significant overdrive. So secondly, the US will have to make climate change a top foreign policy priority. This will mean that climate actions will be driven with every country, in every forum, and through every tool of American foreign policy. The US will need to do this, obviously, over the last 4 years, with a bit of, as Secretary of State nominee Tony Blinken said, humility and confidence. Obviously, the US is not in the same leadership position that it was 4 years ago, and so it'll need to sort of re-enter that international stage with that mindset. So working with over 60 leading experts, we developed a detailed agenda for how to deliver on such an agenda, what that would look like kind of on the ground. I won't go into a lot of the details on these recommendations. You can read about it. We'll share it with Jennifer that can send it back around. But I'm going to focus on a couple of the pieces from China. Obviously, the relationship between the US and China is at a very different point than it was at the end of the Obama administration. There are huge geopolitical tensions. At the end of 2016 with climate change, cooperation, kind of the rare shining light, but tensions are obviously higher between the US and China than they were at the end of 2016. So while the US and China cooperated on climate change at the end of 2016, I think it'll be challenging for the Biden administration to have a forceful cooperation agenda with China in the early days, given the geopolitical dynamics in both countries. But despite these tensions, the US and China must find a way forward on climate change. The US and China, along with the EU, are the world's largest emitters. They're the largest markets. They're major financial players. They have huge global influence. So what these countries do dramatically reduce emissions matters both for our ability to address the climate crisis and to show other countries that we're responsible, good players. China's shifts on coal, renewables, electric vehicles creates ripples around the world. Likewise, when the US was acting aggressively on climate change, it was able to help push other countries to join a global coalition to combat climate change. So this US-China climate dynamic will be complex, but we need to find a way forward. So let me end with, I think, 3 potential areas of opportunity. First, the US and China will need to work to strengthen both each other's climate ambitions. China's carbon neutrality before 2060 was an important step forward, but what China what China announced on Saturday, just this Saturday, shows a bit more progress. But China will have to be bolder in its near-term targets in the 14th five-year plan and its enhanced nationally determined contribution that puts forward before COP26. The second piece, and I know other colleagues will speak to this, they'll have to undertake potentially parallel initiatives that advance US interests. It'll be harder to find areas at the end of 2016, but over time, I'm sure these 2 countries can find areas where they can work together. And then lastly, I think the 2 countries will have to work together to green overseas investments, including through China's Belt and Road Initiative. China is a leader in solar, wind, smart grid technologies, number of these things, but it still continues to invest a bit too much in overseas fossil fuel investments. So we're obviously at an important inflection point with both, huge challenges, but also amazing opportunities. If the US and China don't rise to this moment, then current and future generations are in deep trouble. So thank you, and I will turn it over to Alvin. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Jake. So I want to start with that September 22nd announcement by President Xi at the UN General Assembly. That was a really huge announcement if you're watching climate policy. We have the world's largest emitter, the largest user of coal, and the largest population, saying that they're going to achieve carbon neutrality just 10 years after developed countries. So the EU has announced a 2050 target. The US is very likely to do the same. And China is saying that they'll just be 10 years after that. And so that was an announcement that surprised, I think, just about 99% of the observers of Chinese climate and energy policy. I would say that it probably surprised 95% of Chinese officials and SOE heads. And so right now within China, there's a process of trying to figure out what does that 2060 carbon neutrality target mean for our policies and for our business. And of course, what Jake said is that really what we want to focus on for climate, for hitting 1.5 degrees Celsius, is what do we do in the next 5 to 10 years to really hit that target and to put us on the pathway to carbon neutrality. So I think the positive thing is that even with the US having President Trump in this turnaround in climate policy, China has continued to lead the world in things like renewables installations. Wind and solar have been the biggest market. China has been the biggest market since 2013. You've had about $810 billion in renewables investments from 2010 to 19. China has the most renewable energy jobs in the world. It's about 4.1 million jobs in solar, wind, and other renewables. China is the largest electric vehicle market in the world, probably will hit about 1.3 million electric vehicle sales this year, and Ilaria is gonna talk more about that. And so it has a lot of momentum, but we all know that carbon neutrality, 1.5 degrees Celsius, is a very challenging target. Last Saturday, the UN, UK, France had this Climate Ambition 2020 summit. President Xi announced some additional targets. This was sort of saying for their carbon intensity reduction target for 2030, instead of a 60 to 65% reduction, there'll be over 65%. For non-fossil energy, increasing the share, previously had been a 20% target, increasing it to 20% by 2030. Now it's a 25% target. And then he said that China will increase its total wind and solar installed capacity to 1,200 gigawatts by 2030. So it's about 480 gigawatts by the end of this year. So we're looking at another 720 gigawatts or so. So that's about 72 gigawatts of wind and solar per year, installation per year. And that'll be taking China from already the highest installation rate around the world to even a bit higher. Of course, as I mentioned, carbon neutrality is extremely a difficult target. And we know that to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius, we want to hit that target as soon as possible. The electric sector is the sector where we expect to be able to move further in that, because we have these technologies like wind and solar that have scaled up, that have gone down in price, largely due to Chinese manufacturing. And then we also know that we also need to develop new technologies such as green hydrogen that will be really useful for other sectors that are going to be hard to decarbonize, such as industry. I think if you look at China's previous targets for renewables, for other kinds of green technologies, I would probably guess that in 10 years, we will have gone beyond 1,200 gigawatts of wind and solar. China tends to pass its own targets as it as it sort of gets momentum in that direction. And then the other point I would make here is that if we're trying to increase the share of non-fossil energy, China has a very good base in terms of renewables. It's increasing share of electric vehicles, but efficiency of course, is going to be a really important part of that. So we want to use as little energy as possible and produce it as cleanly as possible. So Carolyn's going to talk about buildings, and that's going to be a really huge part of it. I guess the other point I would make here is that when we're thinking about how to increase all of the clean energy, the clean technologies, we also have to be thinking about how do we move from fossil technology to clean. So for China, that largely means coal. And for the past 6-7 years, China has had now a very specific coal-focused targets. So reducing the share of coal in its total energy structure and total energy consumption to 58% or less by the end of this year, 2020, from 64% in 2015. It's already gone below 58%, so it's about 57% by this year. And so the question is, how much more can we continue to reduce that? So increasing non-fossil, reducing the share of coal. And then importantly for the power sector, China is still building coal power plants and still increasing its total capacity. So what is the point at which total net capacity of coal power plants peaks? And then also when do we have peak generation, peak coal consumption in the power sector? Those are going to be really important questions, and we're hoping to see more clarity on that in the next 5 years. And then in terms of carbon neutrality, we know it's not just a technical challenge. Really, when you've got nearly 3 million coal mining workers in China, you've got others working in coal power plants or in a variety of heavy industry that uses a lot of coal. And a lot of times, some of these workers don't have the most education. So we need to think very seriously about that social and economic transition so that we don't leave anyone behind. When we get into more detail about thinking about carbon neutrality, I think that also means we need to look at the state-owned enterprises, the generators. How are they going to decarbonize? How are they going to start moving towards carbon neutrality? And then we have to think about some of those key provinces that are both big coal users, but also have now very substantial wind and solar capacity. How do we also manage that transition within the provinces? So I'll leave it at that. I think certainly there's challenges in China, but I think it's moving in the right direction. And so we need to sort of think, how do we sort of implement these changes? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Alvin and Jake. I have like 10 questions here. I got to hold off because I got the other people speaking. But want to also mention to the audience out there that please, anytime you could start tweeting and emailing in questions. For the Twitter, it's @WilsonCenterCEF. And then the email, this is all underneath the webinar that you're watching. Please email tongshin.zhu@wilsoncenter.org. You'll find that underneath the webinar. All right. How about Carolyn? Do you want to share your screen and start telling us your story about that small sector of buildings in China? How do we clean them and green them?
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks for the lead-ins, Jake and Alvin. Such a pleasure to hear your perspective. So I'm going to just talk very briefly about the building sector. And Alvin pointed to the importance of efficiency, electrification, decarbonization. A lot of folks don't know that buildings are actually the world's largest source of primary energy use. They account for about 40% of total primary energy use. And when we consider both greenhouse gas emissions from operations as well as materials and construction, almost 40% of total CO2 emissions. So it's a critical sector. What's more, the US and China account for approximately 40% of global building energy use. And because China is constructing a lot of new floor space, we're seeing that's going to increase over time. So some good news or some opportunity here. According to the World Economic Forum, about half of all energy in buildings from buildings could be reduced through new energy efficient equipment and systems. Some bad news, according to Architecture 2030, less than 1% of buildings are retrofitted annually. And you know, that has a lot to do with the time intensity, the expense associated with preparing buildings for retrofit. Often that requires carefully calibrated models, building simulation, on-site audits, and it prevents even cost-effective retrofit projects from going forward. And that's global. It's an issue that all markets face. So within that context, I just want to share some of China's key energy-related policies and programs for the building sector. You know, China has, under the 13th five-year plan, taken a very comprehensive approach to improving energy performance in both existing buildings and new buildings. And we anticipate the same under the 14th five-year plan. So to speak, you know, specifically to existing building retrofit, which we know is going to be so critical to put the globe on a path to a 1.5 degree global surface temperature rise by the end of the 21st century. Energy efficiency retrofits for 500 million square meters of existing residential building floor space and 100 million square meters of existing commercial and public building floor space is currently being implemented. We do anticipate that as central government subsidies slow, the retrofit work may be slowed, which means that we need in China to begin thinking about leveraging private sector finance and introducing business models and other mechanisms to allow cost-effective retrofits to go forward, even without aggressive subsidy programs. I also want to point to another policy being implemented or piloted in China, and that's building energy benchmarking and transparency programs. And these are widely implemented in the United States. There's about 30 jurisdictions that have benchmarking and transparency ordinances in place that have done a lot to move energy performance forward. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but I'm happy to answer questions later or provide additional resources. What I think is exciting is that we do see in China, both at a national level and at a subnational level, pilot activity in benchmarking and transparency. And one example of that, I think many are familiar with Changning District in Shanghai, which implemented a program to benchmark and disclose building energy usage performance, and also to aggressively retrofit about 100 buildings. I worked recently with World Resources Institute to put together a very detailed building efficiency targets playbook, and it's a case study based guidebook to assist municipalities to implement energy efficiency targeting and retrofit programs. And we drew on the Changning District Shanghai model. Because of limited time, I won't go into a lot of detail here, but what I want to say is that I think there are two important components of this program. One is that Changning District early on partnered with World Bank and some international consultants, and they put together a CO2 abatement cost curve. And what that curve showed them was that existing building energy efficiency improvement was the single largest emission reduction opportunity for the district, which is amazing. And it also, it was also one of the most cost-effective ways to reduce the carbon footprint for the district. So the district leadership set a target to reduce current energy consumption in 100 existing buildings by about 18% over 5 years, equivalent to 33,000 tons of coal equivalent. And by the end of the 5-year program, they had implemented about 45 existing building retrofit projects. They had saved nearly the 33,000 tons of coal equivalent. They were about 31,000. Reduced emissions by 63,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And by and large, a really successful program. They were innovative in terms of implementing policies, drawing on national and local subsidies, and also deploying a building energy performance monitoring system, which was really impressive. So with that being said, the US and China, again, because we consume and contribute to so much of the world's global energy consumption in our building sectors, face similar challenges. We have an aging building stock, and I know part of the Biden-Harris plan is to incorporate building efficiency, not only to support the 2050 carbon neutral pledge, but also to deliver new jobs. And at Berkeley Lab, we are in the business of technology innovation. We sit at the nexus of technology and policy. And with funding from Building Technologies Office, we've developed a building efficiency targeting tool for energy retrofits called Better. And it's a very lightweight, free, open source web app that helps building operators target and prioritize energy efficiency upgrades. Uses really minimal data, which means that buildings, even in the most underserviced communities, can take advantage of this web app to identify energy and cost-saving opportunities. It provides a preliminary estimate of the size and makeup of potential energy efficiency projects. You can see the web app URL in the lower left, and I encourage folks to check it out or email me if you want more information. It's being used all over the world, including in China. And as far as the lab is concerned, we think, not only is this going to be critical to meet global climate and energy goals, but also in this unprecedented time of a pandemic, the analysis can be completed without on-site audits or inspections, allowing energy efficiency workers to plan and develop building retrofit and commissioning projects, even in the midst of a pandemic. So helping to preserve jobs at a time when nearly 400,000 American energy efficiency workers have been left unemployed because of COVID. And then I described below here, we estimate that a fully implemented Better could help reduce emissions of about 165 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent globally by 2030. So these are our goals. I'm happy to provide additional information on the work happening in China on retrofitting, as well as this new web app for the US and global markets can be used anywhere, as I said. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you. And Carolyn, I know Carolyn has to slip off because another meeting came up, but just real quick, just because there's one question I was going to ask at the end, where you mentioned that this tool is being used, and is there any example in the US of a city or state that really is a leader in energy efficient building retrofits, and if so, why?
Fantastic. Great question. So I think Washington, D.C., their high performance, high performance buildings program is, I think, a model for other cities. They're piloting Better. We're really excited. We ran Better on about 4,000 office buildings recently with them. So excited to see how their new high performance buildings program delivers real tangible energy climate reductions in the city. And I could name a few more, but I think I'm impressed by DC.
Yeah, well, just so I want everyone to know that Carolyn mentioned World Resources Institute, and I was going to have someone from WRI come and speak with some other folks. We're going to have a city climate meeting next month, and we're going to pull Carolyn back because she had to leave early today to get some more, because I want more stories from you. But thank you very much, Carolyn. And
thank you, Jennifer.
All right, so and I think we're going to shift on over to Li Shuo. So here, you've heard some stories today, Li Shuo. What have you got to tell us about China carbon neutrality, coal-fired power plants? The floor is yours.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks very much, Jennifer, for having me. It has certainly been a very dynamic few months here in China with regard to our domestic climate discussion. Let me try to make 3 points, and I'll try to also kind of bring in the concepts that you mentioned, including coal, but also the U.S.-China future climate engagement. The first point I want to make is the recent progress or the recent announcements are made actually under quite challenging political conditions. And what I'm referring to here is, of course, the September 22nd announcement from the Chinese President Xi Jinping to try to achieve carbon neutrality before 2060, but also the most recent announcement made last Saturday at the Climate Ambition Summit, which essentially increases some of the headline targets of China's 2030 climate plan. The challenging political conditions, I think, are important for us to realize. Number one, some of the previous speakers have already mentioned, U.S.-China relationship is at the rock bottom, and that relationship saw quite major improvement of the climate ambition of both countries 5 years ago under the Obama administration. Secondly, in addition to the U.S., other non-European major emitters are also quite slow with regard to their climate action. And number three, the pandemic here, of course, also imposed a lot of economic pressure for China's low carbon development. I want to make this point because I think these are important contexts for us to understand the recent announcements. In a way, these announcements cannot be taken for granted. And if in fact, as Alvin has already mentioned, if we go simply back for a few months, many probably wouldn't foresee any of those announcements, including the NDC enhancement, but also the carbon neutrality pledge. The second point I want to make is these recent announcements and statements, while politically significant, are still not enough from a climate science and ambition point of view. Here, I just want to kind of reinforce some of the points that Alvin has already made. I think China could and should do more, and further climate action has already been demonstrated as positive and good, not only for China's environment, public health, but increasingly international image. And it is also in line with the desire of the country to transform itself from a manufacturing-based economy to a more service-based one. Specifically, I think many people in the climate community in China, but also abroad, were hoping for more progress with regard to coal, which we haven't seen by the September and the December announcements. With regard to carbon neutrality, I think there are still a lot of clarification questions. I don't want to go into the nitty-gritties, but just to point out whether carbon neutrality applies to only CO2 emissions or all types of greenhouse gases is a very important one. And with regard to China's Peking commitment, I think many are hoping for that the Peking should appear within the time period of the 14th five-year plan, which is between 2021 and 2025. My third and last point is there is still more coming up, both positive and negative, both domestic and international. On the positive side, the environmental ministry in China, as a result of the carbon neutrality pledge, has already announced that it will require our provinces to develop their plans to peak their emissions. So I think going forward, you will see a more diverse range of actors. And here, some interesting parallel actually, with the US, more subnational actors feeling not only the pressure, but also the responsibility to act. The players that we haven't really brought into previously, the climate debate here in China. And we can also expect more engagement and more involvement of the key polluting industries, such as iron, steel, cement, the power sector, of course. I think those industries are feeling now the need to do more to keep their emissions and to bring their emissions as low as possible. On the negative side, of course, as Alvin mentioned, China is still building more coal-fired power plants. And this is actually quite ironic, not only from a climate and environmental point of view, but from a simple economic point of view. The existing coal fleets operate at around half the time, and they are already losing money. So it's quite ironic that we are building more at this moment. I would also encourage colleagues to pay attention to other heavy industries here in China. It is very likely that this year, the output of steel, the output of cement in China will surpass the level of last year, which is simply quite astonishing if you consider that we basically lost 2 months' time to COVID. So in other words, we risk falling back to the infrastructure heavy development model, exacerbated by the pandemic. And then on the international side, the EU and China have been engaging on the climate issue. I think one can argue in a way that the European Union played a role or made some contribution with regard to China's carbon neutrality announcement. And with the latest climate target enhancement from the European Union, it has definitely been perceived as a more credible climate partner vis-a-vis the US. And with the US, as Jake has already mentioned, the relationship overall, but also in the field of climate change, will be quite complicated. A lot of things have already changed. But I think the incoming administration certainly recognizes the importance of China, but how will it engage with Beijing? I think is going to be a very, very big and very, very important question. Perhaps that we can talk further about in the Q&A. I would also say, as my kind of concluding remark, that the Xi Jinping announcement made last Saturday, in a way, also leaves the door open for further U.S.-China engagement. And going back to Jake's point, to collectively enhance the near-term ambition of both the U.S. and China. So with that, I turn it back to you, Jennifer, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you. Lots of positive, negative. My emotions were going up and down, Shuo, but no, good. We definitely, just so everyone knows, in the Q&A, I do want to talk about different avenues that you all might see for either US-China direct, parallel, I don't know, competitive, that kind of engagement around climate. It'll be good to hear your concerns, and questions are coming in. Please remember, you can email questions in at tongxingzhu@wilsoncenter.org, or do tweet us at WilsonCEF. All right, Ilaria, this is your time.
Good morning. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to everyone who's spoken. It's nice to learn so much on a Monday morning. So let me just share my screen. All right, so I'm going to be speaking about electric mobility in China and the US, and I'm looking forward to an engaging discussion later. So I'm just going to cover a little bit of the data and give you a bit of a snapshot. So obviously we care about transportation because it is a big contributor to CO2 emissions. It's about 25% globally. When you look at China and the US, it is the #1 contributor to CO2 emissions in the US, about 30% this year. I'm sorry, this data is a little bit outdated, but I liked it because it will give you like a comparison between the two countries. So it's, and what I would draw your attention to is that most of that, those emissions from transportation come from on-road transportation. So we're talking about buses, cars, trucks. For China, this is probably, we could say, the #3 challenge, but it's still pretty big. challenge. Now, of course, electric vehicles are one of the most cost-effective technologies we have right now to achieve zero emission transportation. And China's been performing very well on that front. So both from a manufacturing perspective and actual deployment sales, China leads the rest of the world. There's more electric vehicles on the roads right now in China than anywhere else in the world combined. And China has really achieved that through a combination of different policy, industrial policy, targeting manufacturing, an aggressive public fleet, public transit electrification program, so through public procurement. Purchase subsidies, of course, have been very important to incentivize buyers. And those are going away. We'll talk about those and what that means. Of course, local government incentives have been very important in China as well. Among those, I would draw to your attention to license plate facilitations, which of course in some cities in China are very hard to get if you don't have an electric vehicle. And finally, what is called often called the dual credit program. This is quite similar to the zero emission vehicle program in California. It's a little complicated, but basically manufacturers earn credits based on the fuel efficiency of vehicles and the specifications of the electric vehicles they manufacture, and the number, and a certain percentage of those credits need to be either earned for the production of electric vehicles or by buying those credits from manufacturers that have produced an excess of electric vehicles in excess of that target. So a little complicated, but basically it's incentivizing manufacturers, and it clearly puts the onus on manufacturers to produce and sell electric vehicles. So that's great, but I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that this is still a very small share. It's a very small industry globally, right? So we still have a long ways to go, and frankly, unless you're living in Norway and you're buying a vehicle right now, it's probably going to be an internal combustion engine vehicle, which really, that's why we really need to pay attention to emission standards, fuel efficiency standards, and fuel efficiency standards that I will say are also a good tool to actually promote electric vehicles as well for manufacturers. So yeah, I just wanted to draw this because there's been a lot of talk about electric vehicles on the stock market, and you wouldn't know based on the shares of Tesla, but yes, it's still a very small industry. And the market share though has been growing very quickly, right? In China right now, there's almost 5% of new sales are of new energy vehicles, which largely battery electric vehicles. And US though has been lagging a little bit behind, in large part because policies have not been particularly supportive. So finally, what are, targets are always great to have on PowerPoints, and China is always great at providing some targets. The latest new energy industry plan, and when we talk about new energy vehicles, as I said, it's mostly battery electric vehicles. So the new energy vehicle industry plan has a target of 20% of new sales to be NEVs by 2025. That's been reduced slightly compared to what it was supposed to be after COVID, but it's still pretty ambitious. Public fleets, as I mentioned, China's been performing quite well in terms of public transit electrification. Almost half of buses in China now are electric, so that's pretty good considering these are very polluting vehicles. And then there's more of a vaguer target, which probably means that they're expecting half of new sales to be of electric vehicles in 2035. So that's, again, pretty ambitious, pretty good. Now, usually usually the US doesn't have targets, but you may have noticed it was an election year. So we're lucky to have targets thanks to the Biden campaign promises, let's put it that way. Some of these may be complicated due to Congress, but we can look at them. So one of them is to actually expand charging infrastructure, which obviously is a major component. It's a major let's say it's a major part of the calculus when a new consumer wants to buy a vehicle, right? You want to make sure that you can actually charge your vehicle. So that's going to be quite important. Another one I would draw your attention to is actually school buses. This is quite important because there's actually more school buses in the US than there are city buses. And there's about 500,000 of them. They're mostly running on diesel. So actually electrifying these would be a pretty big step. And then finally, there is a target to have all new buses produced in the US be electric. Again, public transit in the US is not what it is in China. So there's only about 68,000 city buses in the US, but still, that's still a pretty big contributor of air pollution, and important to get those off the roads, basically. So of course we can talk about targets all day, but if we don't have the policies to get there, that's not going to be particularly helpful. And the big change in China that we need to keep an eye on is that we're moving away from purchase subsidies. Now they've been there's been a delay in the phase out, so we're going to have subsidies through 2022. And then we're going to continue to have the sales tax exemption as well, which of course, that it all helps, but this is no longer going to be the main driver of sales in China, I think. At this point, the subsidies are relatively small. The main driver is what I mentioned before, the dual credit policy, which really puts the pressure on manufacturers to actually produce vehicles that consumers want and actually market them and sell them as well. The other, we're going to continue to have some local government incentives of different kinds. And, there's still going to be a very ambitious push to develop the infrastructure. Now, the US is almost more interesting because there's actually going to be a big change with the Biden administration, as I mentioned. And one of those big changes is that the Biden administration has been the Biden campaign has signaled that it really intended to revise the fuel economy standards, which were rolled back during the Trump administration. And that rollback was evaluated to have was expected to have a very negative impact on electrification rates in the US. So if economy standards are raised, and the signal is that the target is to actually achieve zero emission in the transportation in light and medium duty vehicles through these economy standards, that's quite impressive. The other tool is the ZEV program, which is sort of the US equivalent of the dual credit program, which again puts pressure on manufacturers. This has been a program that's been in California for a few years. It was challenged under the Trump administration, but despite that challenge, many states have adopted it. And I think that we'll probably continue to see that expanding under the Biden administration. And of course, we're going to continue having tax rebates and financial incentives at the local level, which we've had so far. This is just a snapshot again, China and the US. There's a lot going on beyond that. Europe now is expected to be the largest market this year for electric vehicles. And we've heard some very ambitious targets from Chile, which wants to electrify all its public transit. And already Santiago, for example, is the largest city outside of China in terms of electric buses. So of course, there's a lot going on globally, but I think Jennifer is going to cut me off if I keep talking. So looking forward to questions, and thank you.
No, that was great. And I think that, we are seeing, and as you were talking, you had your slide up with the parallel kinds of targets. I have some questions here, and Matt Cheatwood, he does a lot of work in rural China issues. He noted that, many cite climate change as a no-brainer opportunity for US-China cooperation, but any policy alignment, like the goals you had there, Ilaria, seem to be coincidental rather than intentional coordinated cooperation. Now, in your view, I guess this is now for anyone, what are the main obstacles preventing coordinated cooperation, and what recommendations would you make to both governments to foster cooperations? How do NGOs fit in the equation? So kind of hold on to that, and just note that Steve Wolfson from the EPA General Counsel's office just also kind of echoes, how do the panelists see the increase in political tension, so that's his obstacle clearly, between the US and China affecting prospects for increasing US-China cooperation on environment and energy issues? So maybe Ilaria can start, since let's just talk, maybe on the electric vehicle space. Is this just kind of like coincidental? We're both driving down the same highway, but we're not coordinating.
Yeah, I think it's actually, there was quite a bit of cooperation in terms of policy during the Obama administration, and I think that was very helpful for China to get its policies off the ground. But I think it's actually going to be a bit challenging to have cooperation in this area, or rather than challenging, it may not even be entirely necessary, in the sense that the private sector is very important here, and there's a lot of competition. And in competition here, when we're talking about sales of electric vehicles, is probably a good thing. So I think there can be some cooperation in terms of efficiency standards and public transit. We can learn from each other, for example. But in terms of actual coordination, I mean, I'm not sure it's necessarily. Let's put it this way. If the US and China coordinate on their targets for electrification, that's fine, but I'm not sure that's actually the most important step that we need to promote electric vehicles. We need just more stricter policies incentivizing electric vehicles and sales, and we need, we need incentives for technology to develop further, and we need to put frankly, pressure taxes on polluting vehicles, right? So I think there's other areas where cooperation is probably more important. And as I said, there was a lot of cooperation in the earlier phases, and perhaps it's not quite as necessary later on. And again, there's a lot of cooperation going on in the private sector, right? Tesla's doing really well in China, and there are Chinese companies like BYD is doing well in the US. So I'm not, there may be a difference between what the governments can do and what private sectors can do.
Okay, that's great. Jake, Alvin, Shuo, would you like to jump in a little bit on this, this broader question of U.S.-China cooperation, coordination, ignore each other, and we'll both do whatever that's coming up from out. Go ahead, Shuo.
Yeah, no, I think these are great questions, and say hi to Matt. Used to be my classmate actually. I think it is a very, very policy relevant question, right? And we need to kind of look into where cooperation is needed and who are the best actors to cooperate. And because sometimes, as Ilaria has already mentioned, governments may not be best positioned. It could be private sectors, it could be NGOs, sometimes it could be think tanks and academia. With regard to what will prevent effective engagement or coordination or whatever words that you want to use between the US and China, of course, the bilateral relationship is one major barrier. It's fair to say that with the US domestic political situation, there is definitely much smaller room for kind of a cooperative approach. I would say from the Chinese perspective, one additional barrier, if we are talking about the international commitments of these two governments, the additional barrier is this perception that there is already a asymmetry on the delivery of the existing commitments. The US will struggle to deliver what President Obama pledged in the run-up to the 2015 Paris climate conference, the 26 to 28% emission reduction, whereas the Chinese is shooting beyond what it committed. And in fact, just 2 days ago, also enhanced. We can have a separate discussion on whether the Chinese offer in the first place was ambitious or not. But from a political or a diplomatic point of view, there is an asymmetry. So that will constrain the Chinese policymakers. If there is going to be, let's say, some kind of future US-China deal. And then, of course, the third barrier, or the third thing is the credibility, the general credibility of the U.S. In light of the 4 years that we just observed, the kind of the seesaw of climate politics in the U.S.
Yeah, I'll add just
that's you.
One more minute, so we'll get the U.S.-China bilateral right here in the front. I think it's pretty fair to say that the end of the it wasn't the beginning, but at the end of the Obama administration, there was obviously a very strong cooperation / collaboration agenda between the U.S. and China. They were working on building energy efficiency. There was some ZEV stuff, et cetera. There was a joint kind of shared sort of piece, and obviously it was a challenge at the time, right? I mean, the relations weren't great between the U.S. and China then. Climate was the only thing that they weren't fighting over at the time. But that has gotten a bit worse, that geopolitical relationship. So I think, as we looked at it with this group, I think, cooperate and collaborate is not likely to be the formulation, at least in the public facing piece. I think it's a little bit more going to be convince, cajole, and maybe compete. We want to add another C. And so I think that, at the national level, that, I think there will be opportunities for, states and cities maybe to collaborate, because the geopolitics between them is different. And as Ilaria said, companies are obviously, working in kind of both spaces, number of companies. But I think there is opportunity for them to, maybe this is delusional, but it'd be interesting to wake up and see the two of them competing to see who can have the best zero emissions vehicles sold around the world, and compete to see who can break into the African market with the best vehicles, or the Latin American market, or the Southeast Asian market as is places boom, or working to see how to help Africa become, low carbon fastest. And use their technologies to help that continent become, the glowing example of low carbon kind of growth. So I think there's opportunities there, but it's a little bit less going to be sort of government to government kind of sitting at the table and kind of working, or researchers, but I think there is, obviously a lot of dialogues happening between government, subnational governments, companies, NGOs, et cetera, on kind of building, a solid foundation for something, not collaborate or cooperate, but something different.
Alvin, did you want to jump in with any quick comment?
Sure.
I mean, I should note that a couple of people are starting to ask, like Jillian Zwicker at World Resource Institute. She said maybe for Shuo, but it could be for anyone. Kind of following up on what Jake just said about the subnational kind of climate action that we're seeing. Do you see, maybe, and Alvin, you could talk on this too. I mean, is that really an area where there could be more of, or needs to be kind of like subnational cooperation? And if so, what could that look like? I mean, we do have, the country of California, remember about a couple of years ago, signed the California-China Climate Initiative, right? That, and then there are some cities. So yeah, curious, maybe Alvin, you could start, if that's an avenue you want to take, and if not, we'll pass it on to Shuo, the subnational. But you could, any question you'd like to answer along these lines.
Yeah, well, I think certainly a California-China collaboration could continue. And I think, we had to be, I think probably the first year of the Biden administration, and kind of talking with China about climate, there does have to be that rebuilding of trust, and then this kind of careful scoping out and discussion of how exactly to work together, or to talk about these common challenges that are facing both countries. So I still am kind of an optimist, I guess. I see things like power sector decarbonization. How do you have a more flexible grid? I mean, there's a lot of learnings that can be done with the US and China, between the EU and China, between Germany and China, about how do you run your grid better to take advantage of renewables being, very low cost, but variable. And so how do you do that with a more flexible grid, with more storage, that kind of thing, demand response? I think if you can find those kinds of areas, there's certainly a lot of area for cooperation at the kind of policy technical level between those experts, or even at the subnational level.
Which we did see a lot, when, I mean, Ilaria mentioned about like the EV cooperation, and there was also clean, energy efficient building cooperation, but again, it was like the national labs. So you think that could still be, that could be a promising area under the new administration, where in essence that they could be kind of unfettered to have that cooperation, but it will also have to mean that the Chinese side will be open to welcoming that. Do you think that that's possible today?
Again, I think it's about rebuilding the trust and having those kinds of conversations, but I think it is possible. And it's certainly needed.
Okay. Hey, Shuo and maybe Ilaria can jump in too. But the question about the subnational kind of cooperation, because everyone's kind of brought it up. Do you see, are there some, or even if it's not bilateral cooperation, are there some examples like within China where we are seeing local governments? I mean, they're being pressured to be cleaner and greener. You mentioned the MEE carbon neutral targets that have to be set. What are some possible, areas of optimism there?
Yeah, no, I think that's also a very relevant question. As I said, I think the new trend, at least over the next 5 years, will be, increasingly our subnational actors will be engaged in the climate conversation, and to a very large extent, they're pressured to do so as a result of the national carbon neutrality pledge. I won't go into kind of the sectoral areas where I think are the most promising, because it is really a case by case, right? It depends on which city or which state in the U.S. and which province and which city here in China. But what I would say is I would agree, and many others have already made this point. Subnational level cooperation is needed because it builds in durability in future U.S.-China climate cooperation, but also, and this is from the Chinese perspective, subnational level engagement is important because international engagement in general, in the Chinese context, plays a very important agenda setting role. If you have California or any other U.S. states or cities bring in a certain agenda, in this case, low carbon development, to their Chinese counterparts, it helps keeping that issue on their plate, which in many cases here in China, in many places here in China, is now the case. So it has a very important and critical additional value to add.
Okay, great. I have got a question that came in from Fabio Schmocker, the Embassy of Switzerland. He's based here in the US. I have a question regarding the NDC goals of the US. When do you expect Biden to announce new NDCs? I guess because Xi just announced them the Saturday. And does the scope of the goals depend on the outcome of the runoff in Georgia? Jake, do you want to take
that? I'll take that one. I think it's a very good question, and it's hard to I wish I could give you an exact date. I think out of the box, Biden, the Biden-Harris administration is going to reorient climate action. Obviously they said they're going to rejoin the Paris Agreement, but I think that will be the not the only thing that they announce on day one, right? Whatever day one looks like, it might be inauguration day where they make some of these announcements. I think that they, the other sort of benchmark that the Biden-Harris administration has kind of reinforced, and they just reinforced it this weekend, is they're going to be calling for a 100-day summit of world leaders. I think the time frame for when the U.S. can bring forward its nationally determined contribution is, bookended by two factors. One, fast. The world, wants them to come forward with that. Under the Paris Agreement, everybody was supposed to do that now. The U.S. does not have a 2030 target, and so it's sort of supposed to bring that forward. But obviously, the same point, the world recognizes that you don't want the Biden, Harris administration to announce it on day one, because it's going to take some time to build the trust, of what that looks like for the international community. So it's not just a number, but it actually has meaning in terms of some of the policies that they're beginning to move forward with. But at the same time, I think the Biden-Harris administration is going to have to kind of, take some time domestically to build support for that, so that whatever number they bring forward with, that's strong, and hopefully it's really aggressive, because climate change requires aggressive targets. But it's got the sort of backing of the states, cities, companies, et cetera, to sort of drive forward. So my best guess is it will definitely happen before COP26. Summer or sometime before summer is when the U.S. NDC sort of might be brought forward. Sorry, I forgot the second. There was a second part to that question, Jennifer.
Well, and does it depend on what happens in Georgia? Like what happens in the Senate?
Not in an ideal world, we would have the ability to pass climate legislation through Congress. I don't think anybody has envisioned that that's a likely scenario. At least that's not how we've been planning stuff. So it would be helpful what the Senate, elections in Georgia look like. But the reality is the Biden, team is going to, I think, unleash, the power of existing law and the power of what the states and cities have sort of done. So, for example, the Clean Power Plan that the Obama administration, rolled out for power plants, well, lo and behold, the power sector has actually already met that target, and that target was supposed to be in 2025 because what's happening in the markets is driving much faster. So there is this sort of ability, I think, to go a bit faster and to use the power of the tools. If there is a different Congress, it's more likely to manifest in what the infrastructure bill looks like than in some uber climate bill like Waxman-Markey. But I think the U.S. does have a strong ability to drive climate action through, existing law, and through helping to support these states, cities, and companies that sometimes are going much faster than what the federal government's already doing anyway. So I don't think it's dependent upon Congress. It would be obviously nice to have a better Congress, driving this climate action, but I don't think that that's what the Biden-Harris administration will be banking on for its NDC.
And Jake, right at the very beginning, you had a nice slide that was full of like little dots that showed domestic climate action. And besides California, are there some other states, I mean, dare I say some red states where you're seeing some kind of climate action that, because that helps, unleash, I like that, unleash, what's in the existing laws or maybe even going beyond.
Yeah, I think so. So America's Pledge, did an analysis that America's Pledge is good set of numbers. They looked at what's the existing commitments from states, cities, companies deliver, and then they looked at what if a growing number of states and cities adopted these same sort of 10 measures, and they get pretty significant. I forget the exact numbers, but I think it was like on the order of 37% below 2005. Don't totally quote me on that. And then they looked at, well, what if the federal government was also helping? And that got you towards the 50% sort of range. So it's, obviously hard to tell what the federal government kind of actually can deliver. But, we are seeing climate action happening, so there's, post the Trump administration, withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, a bunch of states effectively adopted, the US 26 to 28% target, said they're going to drive that. We've seen places like, New York, not just California, driving climate action, Illinois looking at it, and going to net zero. So, we now have, more than 50% of people, electricity consumers, live in a electricity district that has a net 100% clean target in their portfolio. And that's in places like obviously California, but it's also in places like parts of Texas, parts of Ohio, parts of West Virginia now have, utilities that have, 100% clean in their commitments and in their kind of investment plans going forward. So it's diversifying, but obviously I think we're going to need to kind of put a lot more of the pedal to the zero emissions vehicle, car in the coming 4 years, at the state city level.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to shift the topic just a little bit to Alvin. When you made your comments, you mentioned a little bit about the social challenges of the coal transition, and I was thinking, that what about it? I mean, that was in China, and can you tell us, like, what is the Chinese government? Are there efforts being made to kind of help mitigate some of this, to have kind of like a just transition? And I'd also be interested if any of the other speakers want to jump in on this topic. I mean, there's, even shifting to a renewable energy, cleaner economy. Are we making sure that that's also kind of a just transition, that we're not leaving certain communities out? Alvin, do you want to kick us off there?
Yeah. So, industrial restructuring in China is not a new thing. In fact, it's been a core part of the 13th five-year plan. And that was because in the 12th five-year plan, kind of after the 2008 economic crisis, China built a lot of heavy industrial capacity. So think coal mining, iron and steel, and a lot of that was really just too much. And so in the 13th five-year plan, they'd already foreseen and been pushing on reducing excess industrial capacity. And of course, that means some of those workers will be losing their jobs or will be relocating. And so they had set aside several years ago about 100 billion renminbi. So that's about 15 billion US dollars to help with this. It could be providing sort of retirement funds for people who have early retirement, workers who have early retirement in coal mining or iron and steel, could be retraining. But China's a huge country, and for a country of 1.3 billion, maybe 3 million jobs is a couple percent, but it's still very sizable, and it's more about the specific locations where you have concentrations of coal mining workers or other kinds of heavy industry workers. So in a place like Shanxi province, where you have a quarter of the coal mining workers, when times are good, and those companies and those workers, it's a good place to work in terms of salary. But now we're seeing, of course, that as things transition, they're not going to be ready for this transition unless they get some more active assistance. So both for the companies to be thinking about how they can transition to kind of low carbon development, and then also for those workers, there does need to be, and for those provinces and cities, how do they focus on new kinds of industry, and how do they learn new skills to sort of be part of the sort of the modernizing low carbon economy.
Yeah, and also the recovering economy. Shuo?
Yeah, no, I agree with Alvin. I think the just transition issue, it is a very relevant one. It is also a very legitimate issue. We shouldn't kind of dismiss the issue of employment. But I would also kind of caution against just directly applying the just transition framing used in the Western sense to the Chinese case for at least two reasons. One is, well, I guess this is actually similar, but to many Western countries. But one is the just transition framing has been used, where employment has been used as an excuse to delay action. The second thing is the just transition framing would only make sense when you are very determined with regard to from where you want to transition to where, right? From the fossil energy to clean energy. And that's not yet the case here in China. As I said, we are still building more coal, right? So in a way, we are actually still creating more coal-related jobs. And that's certainly not compatible, not only with the latest climate announcement, but also from an economic and environmental point of view. So the point here is we need to set that direction clear in the first place before we can talk about employment.
Yeah, and Shuo, do you have a question for any of your other colleagues here? This is what I like doing in the last couple minutes.
I actually do. Ilaria, I wasn't anticipating questions from shooting questions to other panelists, but to Ilaria, I'm less familiar with the EV sector, but I mean, Ilaria, if you are familiar with the wind and solar sector in China, do you think there is actually a parallel between wind and solar and EV? And here, wind and solar have more or less achieved grid parity, right? Meaning that they can compete with conventional, energy sources. I know EV is not there yet, but do you, what's kind of your sense on whether and how EV can get to where solar and wind are now in the Chinese context?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, I think we're actually getting there. The problem with EVs is that the upfront cost is higher, but then if you look at what over time, it's actually very competitive, right? If you look at buses, for example, that you can actually save thousands of dollars, thousands of renminbi by shifting to electric buses. So I think it's more a financing issue sometimes rather than it's more of a business model challenge in some ways. Of course, there's still, we can do a lot of there's a lot of progress to be made on batteries, but with electric vehicles, I think the fact that the big parallel is that we're phasing, China's phasing out subsidies for both for solar and wind and for electric vehicles, and this is because both, as you said, we're getting to the point where they're competitive. So in part, the challenge is taking away the subsidies from the fossil fuel industries as well, right? So that you actually have a real level playing field, and yeah, I think that's so yeah, the business model is really important. The technology progress, we're getting there, And I think consumers are the other component, and I think consumers in China as elsewhere in the world are actually really embracing electric vehicles. So that's where charging infrastructure really comes in, right? You need to ensure that consumers feel confident that they then can use their vehicles. So that's yeah.
Yeah, but also what is parallel, Shuo, to the wind and renewables is that the electric vehicle market in China is not totally a market yet. And, it's very much, but Beijing is going to do that kind of that, what is that? I called it like solar power Darwinism. When they cut overnight, they said, no more subsidies. And then half of the industry fell to the wayside. So it's a different way of creating a market, not quite one that I think the US can emulate. So we're wrapping up here. Jake, do you have any final quick comments? Give each of you all like 15 seconds to say, woohoo, you're optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good place to be when we're worried about how we can find different opportunities to move forward. So I think the piece to watch is how, the US, Europe, and China, can align and drive, greater ambition in the coming years. And I'm very glad that we actually have one additional part of that, which is the US back at the table.
Okay, I think I just got the message that we've actually hit our deadline, but you all got to some good comments in there at the end. I want to thank everyone. We're going to have more meetings on this. Next month, we'll probably dive into city issues a little bit deeper because that's so much fun. And I want to thank you all and thank the audience for their great questions. And yeah, let's get out there and go to work, everyone. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good morning or evening.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.